The wooden shutters didn't just open. They exploded against the wall, splintering the frame, letting the cold judgment of a twilight sky spill into the room. Reverend Elias Moore stood there, a silhouette of pure, unadulterated rage. His boots didn't just step onto the floorboards, they crashed down like gavels, each thud an indictment, a verdict already passed. In the dim light of the hearth, Abigail trembled. She wasn't just holding a bundle. She was clutching the entire world in her arms, a tiny, fragile world named Samuel, still red and wrinkled from the womb, wrapped in the only thing of value she had left, her old linen shawl. "You shame me," Elias spat, and the words were not just words. They were stones. They were whips. "You shame this house. You shame this town. You shame the very church I built with my own hands. And you dare bring that bastard into my sight." "Father," she whispered, but the word caught in her throat, thick with tears and terror. "Please, he's my son. He's just a baby. He did nothing wrong." "He is sin made flesh." Elias's voice was a blade, sharp enough to cut the soul. "You think your weeping excuses this? You think crying wipes clean the stain of your whoredom?" Her voice cracked, a sound of breaking glass. "I was forced. You know I was. Sheriff Wilkins. He came when no one else was home. I begged him to stop." Elias barked a laugh, a horrible, hollow sound that echoed off the bare walls. "You begged?" A righteous woman would have fought. A righteous woman would have screamed loud enough to rattle the very walls of heaven itself. Across the room, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It was her mother, Ruth, pale and trembling, her lips bloodless. She hadn't said a word. Elias had forbidden it. Her silence was just another brick in the wall of Abigail's prison. Abigail fell to her knees, the floorboards digging into her skin. The baby whimpered, a tiny, helpless sound in the suffocating silence, and she pulled him tighter, as if she could absorb the hatred meant for him. "Please," she begged, her eyes locked on the merciless face of her father. "Let him be baptized. At least let him have a name." "He has no father," Elias snarled, leaning down, his breath a blast of winter air. "He is a stain, and a stain must be removed." He didn't raise a hand to her. He didn't have to. His next words were worse than any blow. "You will leave this house at dawn. Take the child. Take your shame. But you do not take our name. You are no longer a Moore." He turned and left, the slam of the door a final, deafening punctuation mark. Abigail was left on the floor, kneeling in a silence that was louder than any scream. She wasn't just being sent away. She was being erased. But as she looked down at the tiny face in her arms, she realized something that chilled her to the bone. Her father hadn't asked a single question about Sheriff Wilkins. He didn't seem surprised or angry at the sheriff. He just seemed angry at her. And a horrifying thought began to form, a seed of doubt so monstrous she could barely contain it. What if her father already knew? What if he hadn't been surprised at all? The nights that followed were a blur of escalating cruelty. No one spoke of it, but everyone participated. The town that had once tipped its hat to the preacher's daughter now turned its back, their faces grim masks of piety. Stones were thrown at the windows of her small sewing shop, not large enough to break the glass, but large enough to break her spirit. Children mimicking the venom of their parents would follow her in the streets, chanting, "Unclean, unclean," their innocent voices twisted into instruments of torture. Her food rations from the general store were mysteriously cut. The baker suddenly had no bread left when she arrived. The butcher would look right through her, serving the customer behind her as if she were a ghost. She was being starved out, slowly, methodically, by a town united in its righteousness. One night, a bottle crashed through her window, not empty, but with a scrap of scripture tied around its neck with a piece of twine. She recognized the spidery handwriting of her own father. "Suffer not a witch to live." It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a death sentence. 3 nights later, she awoke to the smell of smoke and the hellish orange glow of fire. Her shop, the last piece of her old life, was burning. She barely managed to snatch Samuel from his cradle and escape out the back before the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and damnation. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood in the alleyway, clutching her son, watching her life turn to ash. She knew who had done it, not just the hands that held the torch, but the man who had supplied the fire. At dawn, she stood on the threshold of her family home, the baby bundled tight in her arms. Her face was pale, streaked with soot, but her eyes were dry. She had no tears left. The front door closed behind her with a soft, final click. They had taken her belongings from the ashes, not to save them, but to dispose of them. All she had was the shawl on her back, a tin water cup, and the crushing weight of a world that never forgave women for the crimes of men. She had taken only 2 steps down the path when the door creaked open behind her. "Abby," her mother whispered, a desperate broken sound. Ruth ran toward her, her steps clumsy, clutching a small wicker basket wrapped in a dishcloth. "There's bread," she said, her voice shaking, her eyes darting back toward the house. "And lard, and a tin of healing salve for your feet." Abigail froze, her heart a painful knot in her chest. "Mother, I couldn't say anything," Ruth stammered, pressing the basket into her hands. He said if I did, he would—" A roar erupted from the porch, a sound of pure animal fury. "Ruth!" Elias stood there, his face contorted in a mask of rage. "What are you doing?" Ruth instinctively stepped in front of Abigail, a shield made of trembling flesh and bone. "I was only—" The basket was ripped from her hands. Elias didn't just take it. He tore it away and flung it to the ground. The bread scattered in the dust, the precious salve smearing into the dirt. And then he struck her. He hit his wife across the face with the back of his hand, a crack that sounded louder than a gunshot in the morning air. Ruth fell hard, her lips split and bleeding. Elias wasn't finished. He grabbed her by the hair, dragging her back toward the unforgiving door. "Take your filth and go," he screamed at Abigail, his voice cracking with hate. "And know this, you are no daughter of mine." Abigail stood frozen, the world tilting on its axis. Samuel started to cry softly against her breast. She looked down at the smashed bread, at the healing salve buried in the dirt, useless. She saw her mother's eyes, wide with pain, and a desperate, pleading love. Then Ruth was pulled back into the house. The door slammed shut. And then came a sound that would haunt Abigail for the rest of her days, the sharp, sickening snap of a leather belt being unbuckled, followed by the whistle of it cutting through the air, and then a muffled cry of pain from behind the door. He was beating her. He was beating her mother for an act of kindness. Abigail did not scream. She did not run to the door. A cold, hard clarity settled over her. This wasn't just about her sin anymore. This was about power. This was about a darkness in her father that ran deeper than she could have ever imagined. She adjusted her son in her arms, turned her back on the house, and walked. She walked past the ruined basket, past the porch where her mother lay bleeding, past every memory of a life that was now a lie. She did not look back. Not until the house was far enough away that her father's shouts could no longer be heard, but close enough that she could still see the smoke from the chimney, curling into the morning sky like a serpent. She whispered to the tiny bundle in her arms, a vow made of iron and ice. "You will never know this place, and I will never let it know you." And then she kept walking, the dust of the road mixing with the silent tears she finally allowed herself to shed. She had been cast out, erased, and disowned, but she still carried a name no one could ever take from her. Mother. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a new terrifying question began to scream for an answer. The sheriff had violated her. Her father had condemned her. But what if they were connected? What if this wasn't just 2 separate acts of cruelty, but a single coordinated conspiracy to destroy her? The woods were not a sanctuary. They were a predator. Abigail staggered between the gnarled, skeletal fingers of ancient trees, the infant pressed so tight to her chest she could feel his tiny heart beating against her own. Her arms ached with a fire that spread to her shoulders and back. Her legs trembled, each step a negotiation with collapse. Her dress, already threadbare, was now a second skin of sweat and cold mud. Every crackle of a leaf under her bare, bleeding feet was a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a long, mournful cry that seemed to peel the skin from the sky. Another answered, closer this time. She flinched and spun around, her eyes wide and useless in the suffocating dark. The child Samuel whimpered, sensing her terror. Her own heart was a war drum, pounding against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of pure primal fear. She needed water. She needed food. She needed shelter. She needed a miracle. She had followed no path, only a desperate animal instinct to stay hidden, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the town of righteous monsters. But the forest was darker, more alive than she had ever imagined. The shadows writhed and coiled, shifting into shapes of things she didn't dare name. Her foot caught on a thick, snaking root. She pitched forward, crying out as she scrambled to her knees, twisting her body to cushion the baby's fall. He cried out, a sharp, sudden wail of shock and pain. Shh, shh, it's all right, my love. It's all right, Abigail whispered, rocking him desperately, pressing his head to her shoulder. But it was not all right. Nothing was. Her lips were cracked and dry, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Her eyes scanned the darkness, searching for any kind of refuge. She saw a thick-limbed pine tree, its lower branches reaching down like gnarled arms. Maybe if she could climb, just a few feet up, she could rest until morning, away from the things that hunted on the ground. She hoisted herself up, muscles screaming in protest. One hand found a hold on the rough bark. The other clutched her son. She used her knees to push, to balance, to gain just a little more height. For a second, she thought she might make it. Then the bark slipped. The world flipped upside down. The baby screamed, a sound that tore through her. Her back struck the hard earth, knocking the wind from her lungs. And then her head cracked against a stone hidden in the leaves. The stars above her swirled, fractured into a million pieces of shattered light. Her vision narrowed to a tiny dark tunnel. A searing pain exploded in her skull. The baby was still crying, but he sounded farther away now. Was she losing him? Was she losing herself? The darkness at the edge of her vision rushed in, swallowing the last of the light. She was slipping, falling into a black, silent ocean. And then, light. Not the bright, holy light of heaven. Not the unforgiving light of the sun. It was a flicker of orange, the light of a fire. A figure stood a few yards away, cloaked in shadow and smoke, silent as a ghost. It was a man, tall and still, a knife strapped to his side, a bow slung over his shoulder. His hair was long and raven black, and his eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's, ancient and unreadable. He hadn't made a sound. He had just appeared, as if the forest itself had given birth to him. And in that last, fading moment of consciousness, Abigail wasn't sure if she had been found by a savior or a devil. Taza had been hunting. He was tracking a 4-point elk, moving through the forest with a silence passed down through generations. He was alone, as he always was. The wind was his brother, the trees his counsel. Then he heard it, a baby's cry, shrill and wrong, a sound that did not belong in the ancient whisper of the wind. His first thought was that it was a trick. White men, soldiers, had used such tactics before, luring warriors into an ambush with the sounds of distress. His hand went to the bone handle of his knife, but curiosity, a thing he had never been able to kill, tugged harder than caution. He followed the sound, moving from shadow to shadow, his moccasins making no more noise than falling leaves. What he found stopped him cold. It was no trap. In a small grove, huddled at the base of a great pine, was a woman, pale-skinned, her hair matted with leaves and dried blood crusted on her temple. Her body was curled protectively around a child, an infant barely days old, swaddled in what looked like rags. They looked like fallen leaves, discarded and forgotten by the world. He crouched, his hand still near his knife. He watched. He waited. Nothing moved but the tiny, shallow rise and fall of the infant's chest. The woman was unconscious, or worse. He studied her. Her arms were covered in dark bruises. One of her feet was scraped raw, swollen and bleeding. The baby's cheek was a blotchy red from the biting cold. Yet even in what could be her last moments, She held that child with a fierce, unbreakable grip. Taza's jaw tightened. He could walk away. He should walk away. No one would ever know. His own people had cast him out. The white people called his kind savages, thieves, shadows in the woods. If he brought her to a white settlement, they would accuse him of stealing her, of harming her. If he brought her to what was left of his people, they would see her as a burden, a threat. There was no good path here. But the child's cry, a weak, pitiful mewling now, pierced something deep inside him, a part of him he thought had died long ago. With slow, deliberate movements, he reached into his pack. He pulled out his cloak, a heavy thing of bison hide, stitched with years of wear, and lined with the fur of the first great bear he had ever felled on his own. It was his story, his warmth, his shield. He approached them, his steps measured and calm. He knelt beside them and gently, so gently, wrapped the heavy cloak around both mother and child, tucking it in to seal out the cold. "Easy now," he muttered, not to them, but to the spirits of the night, to the forest that watched with 1,000 unseen eyes. He examined her legs. One ankle was twisted badly, the skin raw and weeping from walking too far without proper shoes, or perhaps from her fall. Her hair was stuck to her neck with sweat and blood. He slid his knife from its sheath. The blade, honed on river stone, gleamed in the firelight. He cut a piece of leather from his own wrist binding, and with the gentleness of a healer, used it to tie a splint made of bark to her swollen ankle. Then with a strength that was as quiet as his movements, he picked her up. She moaned softly, a sound of deep pain, but did not wake. The baby stirred, and Taza adjusted his grip, tucking the small bundle closer to his own chest, sharing his warmth. He let out a low whistle, a sound like a night bird. From the deeper shadows between the trees, his horse emerged, silent and waiting. He lifted Abigail into the saddle, careful not to jostle the child, but before he mounted, he knelt by a patch of bare earth. From his satchel, he pulled a small forked twig, smoothed by his own hands, and tied a single black feather to it with a strip of sinew. He planted it upright in the soil. He closed his eyes and whispered something in his own tongue, a prayer to the earth. "Mother, I bring life, not of my own blood. I ask your permission to shelter them. Let their sorrow pass into you, and let your strength pass into them." Only then did he mount the horse. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. All he knew was that she was a mother, and she was in pain, and he would not let her die. Not tonight. He turned the horse toward a hidden path, one that led to his shelter deep in the folds of stone and earth, a place where the wind did not bite and the long, cruel night could not reach. He was an outcast saving an outcast, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this act would change everything. Abigail awoke to the rustling hush of pine needles and the rich, earthy scent of wood smoke. Her eyelids fluttered open, heavy as stones. The world was dim, soft, and completely unfamiliar. She was lying on a pallet of thick animal hides beneath a roof made of bound branches and stretched rawhide. The walls of the shelter curved around her, like the inside of a hollowed-out nest. It was warm. It was safe. It was terrifying. Her heart gave a violent jerk. "Samuel!" Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic breath close by. She turned her head, every muscle screaming in protest, and she saw him, her son, curled beneath a stitched buffalo hide, his tiny cheeks flushed pink from sleep. He stirred, let out a little yawn, and nestled deeper into the warmth. He was safe. The memory slammed back into her like a physical blow. The dark woods, the fall, the crack of her head against the stone, the firelight, the figure in the shadows. And then, nothing. She sat up too fast. A lance of pure agony shot through her ankle. She looked down and saw it was neatly bandaged, braced with a splint of bark. She winced, her breath hissing between her teeth. Suddenly, the opening of the shelter darkened. A figure stepped inside, blocking the light. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. It was him, the man from the forest, the one who had found her. He was even taller in the light, his shoulders broad, carrying a quiet gravity that seemed to bend the air around him. His black hair was braided with small red beads that looked like drops of blood. The bone-handled knife still hung at his side, but he made no move toward it. He was not a threat. He was a mountain. He knelt without speaking and placed a bowl of cool, clear water near her. Then, with the same deliberate care, he set down a bundle of fresh berries, a piece of dried meat, and something wrapped in large green leaves, something medicinal that smelled of mint and earth. She stared, stunned into silence. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He said nothing, not even a nod. He just looked at her. His eyes weren't filled with the hunger or threat she was so used to seeing in men's eyes. There was no pity, no condescension. There was something else, a stillness, a recognition. It felt like looking into a mirror, not at a stranger. Then he stood, turned, and ducked back out of the shelter, leaving her alone with the water and the food. The moment he was gone, a jolt of pure adrenaline shot through her. This was a savage. Everyone knew what they did to white women. Her father's sermons echoed in her head, full of fire and brimstone, stories of captivity and torture. She scrambled for a thick stick lying near the fire pit, gripping it like a weapon. Her son whimpered and she hushed him, her heart pounding. She crawled to the shelter's entrance, peering through a small crack in the hide wall. She could see him. He was tending the fire outside, his back to her, preparing what looked like a poultice over hot stones. He was completely unaware of her. She didn't wait. She didn't think. She acted. Gathering her son in one arm, she slipped out through the back of the shelter, where the hides were loosely tied. The cold morning air hit her like a slap. The woods loomed again, vast and menacing. Fear, cold and sharp, twisted in her gut. She hobbled as fast as she could into the brush, her bandaged ankles screaming with every step. She had to get away. She had to save her son. She made it maybe 100 yards, crashing through the undergrowth before her injured foot caught in a root. She went down hard, once again twisting her body to protect the baby. Branches cracked nearby. She froze, her body rigid with terror. She had been a fool. He had heard her. Now he was coming for her. Now the real nightmare would begin. He was there, standing at the edge of the clearing she had fallen into. He wasn't running. He wasn't angry. He just stood there watching her, his face impossible to read. Abigail pushed herself up, shaking from head to toe. She held the baby in front of her like a shield and hissed, "Don't touch us! Stay away!" He never moved. He just watched her, his silence more unsettling than any threat. After a long, stretched-out pause, he knelt down. He picked up the small pouch of berries she had dropped in her fall and placed it gently on a rock beside her, within her reach. Then he turned and walked away, back toward the shelter. His back was exposed, unthreatening. He wasn't chasing her. He wasn't forcing her. He was giving her a choice. Stay in the cold, dangerous woods and surely die. Or return to the warmth and safety he offered, and trust a man she had every reason to fear. The choice was hers, and it was the most terrifying choice she had ever had to make. She didn't go back to the shelter, not right away. That night she curled up at the tree line, just within sight of his fire. She was too afraid to sleep, but too exhausted to keep watch properly. The baby cried softly, a thin, hungry sound that tore at her heart. She had no milk left. Her body was failing. A fever was beginning to creep into her veins, making her skin feel hot and her tongue feel thick and dry. Near midnight, desperate for water, she stumbled toward the sound of a stream she had glimpsed earlier. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, offering little light. She knelt by the water's edge, cupping the icy liquid in her hands, splashing it on her burning face. She never saw the snake. It was coiled in the damp leaves, perfectly camouflaged. Its strike was silent, fast as lightning. A bloom of sharp, searing pain exploded in her calf, a fire burning its way up her leg under the skin. She screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure agony and terror. And then he was there, Taza. He moved so fast it was as if he had teleported from the fireside to her side. He dropped to his knees, his eyes instantly finding the two small puncture wounds on her leg. Without a word, without a moment of hesitation, he ripped the cloth of her dress away from the wound. He pressed his mouth to the bite and drew the poison into his own mouth. He spat a mixture of blood and venom into the grass, his face grim. Again and again, he repeated the motion, his movements swift and sure. Then he took a handful of the same herbs she had seen him preparing earlier, crushed them between his teeth into a dark paste, and packed the poultice deep into the wound. Abigail sobbed, half from the excruciating pain, half from sheer, dumbfounded disbelief. This man, this stranger, was saving her life. He was taking poison into his own body for her. When he was done, he lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He carried her back to the shelter, his steps steady and sure in the darkness. She was barely conscious, the world fading in and out of focus. He placed her down gently on the pallet of furs, covering her with the heavy bison cloak. Then he did something that shattered the last of her fear. He took her crying child from her limp arms and held him. He held Samuel close against his own broad chest, rocking him gently, warming him with his own body heat as Abigail shivered and burned with fever. Taza sat by the fire the rest of the night. He did not sleep. He did not speak. He only watched the flames, one hand resting on the sleeping child, the other occasionally reaching out to brush the sweat from Abigail's brow with a touch that was impossibly gentle. In the pale gray light of early morning, Abigail stirred. The fever had lessened and her vision cleared. And there he was, kneeling beside her, his eyes heavy with fatigue, but unblinking. His gaze met hers, and for the first time, she did not look away. In that silent, shared look, a new language was born. It was a language of survival, of shared pain, and of an impossible, unspoken trust. She didn't know his name, and he didn't know hers, but in that moment, they knew everything that mattered. He wasn't her captor, he was her protector, and he had just saved her life. Not once, but twice. The days stretched longer, the sun warmer. Time in the small hidden valley began to lose its sharp edges, blurring into a rhythm of birdsong, pine needles, and smoke. They still spoke no common tongue, but somehow Abigail and Taza began to communicate. It started not with words, but with hands, with gestures, with shared tasks. One afternoon, while Samuel napped on a patch of sun-warmed moss, Abigail pointed to herself and mouthed her name carefully. Abigail. Then slowly she gestured to the baby, placing her hand over her own heart. Samuel. Taza watched her, his expression quiet and intense. After a long moment, he picked up a piece of river stone, flat and smooth, and began to scratch on a larger slate near the fire. He drew a symbol. It was a circle, representing a home or a tribe. But inside the circle, he drew a smaller figure, and then a line cutting it off from the rest. An outcast. He tapped the small, broken figure. Then he tapped his own chest. Then he drew another symbol next to it. A woman holding a child, also outside the circle. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. Abigail understood. He was like her, exiled, alone. He wiped the slate clean with the heel of his hand and drew again. Figures with feathers and bows. Then other figures, with rifles and blue coats. A violent, slashing line between them. Soldiers, death, a battle, a memory. He looked at the drawing for a long time, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with a shadow of a pain so deep she could feel it across the fire. He had lost his family, not just been cast out, but had them torn from him. He tapped his own chest again and drew one last shape. A single leaf caught in the wind, alone, adrift. He looked at her, his guard down for just a fraction of a second, and in his eyes she saw the reflection of her own profound loneliness. She reached for the slate to draw her own story, but stopped. Words and pictures felt inadequate. Instead, she pulled a small needle and thread from the tiny sewing kit she had managed to save. She picked up his heavy bison cloak, the one that had kept her and Samuel from freezing to death. The hem was frayed and torn from years of hard wear. She began to stitch. He watched her fingers, mesmerized. He had seen women in his tribe sew, but not like this. Her movements were small, precise, and filled with a kind of prayerful grace. She wasn't just mending cloth. She was mending something else, something between them. That night, the unspoken conversation continued. Taza returned from the woods with a bundle of strange-looking roots and a piece of bark. He placed them carefully near the fire. Abigail, recognizing them as food, took them without a word. She found 2 flat stones and began to grind the roots into a rough flour. She boiled them in a battered tin pot she found in his shelter, adding a pinch of wild garlic she had found growing near the stream. It wasn't much, but when it was done, it was a thick, warm stew. They ate in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with a shared understanding, a quiet partnership. The fire spoke for them. The peace, however, was fragile. A few evenings later, Samuel's cheeks were flushed a dangerous red. His breath came in shallow, rapid pants. His skin burned with a fever that terrified her. Abigail's hands trembled as she dipped a cloth into cool water, laying it on his tiny hot brow. Nothing helped. The fever kept climbing. Helpless tears filled her eyes, blurring the image of her suffering child. Taza watched her, his face a mask of stone. Then without a word, he stood up. He moved with a sudden, decisive purpose. He saddled his horse with calm, practiced movements. He slung a leather pouch across his back and turned to her. He didn't touch her. He simply touched 2 fingers to his own lips, then gently to Samuel's forehead. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a silent promise. Then he was on his horse and riding into the dark woods, vanishing between the trees like smoke. Abigail was alone again, and she waited. Hours crawled by, each one an eternity. The sun fell, plunging the valley into a terrifying darkness. The baby whimpered in her arms, his cries weak and pitiful. She whispered lullabies, her voice breaking, the songs of her childhood turning to ash in her mouth. The wind howled through the pines, sounding like a chorus of grieving mothers. She watched the fire die down to glowing embers. She did not sleep. She just held her son, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Just before dawn, when a sliver of hope had begun to die in her heart, she heard it, the soft thud of hoofbeats on damp earth. Taza returned. His face was drawn, his eyes hollowed out from exhaustion. Mud streaked his boots and leggings. But in his hands, he clutched a bundle of herbs wrapped in fresh doe's skin. There were leaves she'd never seen before, and roots with a dark red vein running down the spine, still caked with the distant soil they'd been pulled from. He had ridden all night, through treacherous country, to find this medicine. For her son, for a stranger's child. He knelt and placed the bundle before her. Steam rose as they boiled the leaves in the small pot. Taza held the baby, his large calloused hands impossibly gentle, holding Samuel upright while Abigail carefully spooned the bitter tea into his mouth, drop by trembling drop. The child sputtered, cried, but drank. And then he grew quiet. The fever broke at dusk. The heat receded from his skin like a retreating tide. Abigail collapsed beside the sleeping boy, her face in her hands, weeping with a relief so profound it felt like pain. Taza stood watch over them all night, a silent, unmoving guardian. Later, as she was preparing fresh bandages for her own ankle, she noticed a tear in the fabric of his leather shirt, near his shoulder. She reached for it instinctively, to offer to mend it, then paused, her fingers hovering just above the tear. Taza didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just watched her. Slowly, she slid the torn cloth from his shoulder, and she saw it, a scar. Not a small one, but a long, jagged slash across his skin, like lightning frozen in flesh. It was old, healed over, but the skin was puckered and angry. It was a wound that should have killed him. She touched it, her fingertips tracing the raised, brutal line. Who did this to you? She whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers for a long moment. Then he looked up at the sky, at the trees, at the world around them. He didn't speak. He just pointed, upward, at the sky, the sun, the wind. All of it. Abigail's breath caught in her chest. She understood. The world did this. Life, men, violence, a pain stitched into the very fabric of the earth. She did not ask again. Instead, she took a clean piece of cloth and gently pressed a healing salve onto the old wound, as if her touch could somehow soothe the memory of the pain. She was careful, firm. He did not look away. When she finished, she rested her hand over the scar, over the healed wound, and for a long, long time they simply sat there, Two souls with torn pasts and brutal scars, quietly sharing the same breath. That night, the fire burned steady and bright, not just for warmth, but for something else, for belonging. But even as this fragile peace settled around them, a new threat was gathering on the horizon, a threat neither of them could have predicted. Miles away, in the town she had fled, Sheriff Wilkins was growing nervous. A loose end was a dangerous thing, and Abigail, the preacher's daughter who knew his secret, was a loose end he had to tie up, permanently. The rains came with the subtlety of an invading army. It began as a low, ominous grumble across the plains, a ripple in the bruised gray sky. Abigail had just finished feeding Samuel, who was now gurgling happily in her lap, when the first drop of rain, cold and heavy, struck her cheek. Taza looked up from the arrow he was fletching, his nostrils flaring as if he could smell the storm's intent. He stood slowly, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Sundowny," he murmured, a word she didn't know but understood perfectly. Thunder's breath. Within moments the sky tore open. Rain didn't fall. It attacked, lashing through the forest in horizontal sheets, drenching everything in seconds. The canvas of their makeshift lodge sagged, heavy with water. The wind didn't howl. It screamed, a high, thin sound of fury, pulling at the stakes of the shelter, snapping thick branches from the trees like they were dry twigs. Abigail clutched the baby to her chest, wrapping them both in the thick wool blanket Taza had given her. Samuel whimpered, frightened by the violent symphony of the storm. Taza rushed inside, soaked to the skin, mud streaking his face. He didn't say a word. He just moved. One of the main support beams of the lodge cracked under the strain, the sound like a rifle shot. The roof began to sag dangerously above them. Without hesitation, Taza shoved the broken beam onto his shoulder, his back bending low, using his own body to hold up the collapsing roof, shielding them as the storm roared and raged around them. Lightning cracked directly overhead. The world flashed a brilliant, terrifying white. For a split second she saw his face, his muscles strained, his jaw set in a grim line of determination. He was a pillar holding back the sky. The lodge began to cave in. Taza let out a low shout, not of fear, but of command. "Down!" he ordered, the single English word sharp and clear over the din. Abigail ducked without thinking, curling her body into a tight ball around the baby. The next few moments were a blur of chaos. Wind, rain, the groaning of wood. Taza's arms braced above them. And then, silence. A profound, dripping silence. The storm had passed as quickly as it had arrived. The shelter had collapsed around them, a wreck of hide and broken poles. But they were safe, huddled in a small pocket of survival that Taza had created with his own strength. Later, after the last of the rain had passed, Taza led them to higher ground, to a small glade ringed by sturdy ancient trees that had weathered 1,000 such storms. And then he went to work. For days he built. This time, it was not a temporary lodge of animal hide and sapling poles. He was building a home. He felled stripped cedar and pine with his small axe, shaping the beams with his own hands. He notched the joints with a piece of sharpened flint, lashing them together with sinew and rope he wove from bark. He covered the roof with layers of bark tiles and thick moss, a living roof that would drink the rain. Inside, he laid a circle of flat stones for a hearth, with a cleverly designed opening in the roof to draw the smoke. When it was done, it was a small, solid cabin, nestled into the landscape as if it had grown there. Abigail stood at the threshold, her arms cradling Samuel. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the spaces between the wood slats, catching in the golden fuzz of the baby's hair. She looked at the sturdy beams, the fire pit, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling. This wasn't just a shelter, it was a promise. "It's a home," she whispered. The words filled with an awe she couldn't contain. Taza didn't speak, but he met her eyes, and in that shared glance, something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, understanding, partnership. It was a look that said, "We survived." That night they sat by their new hearth. The fire danced, casting warm, protective shadows on the walls. Abigail had been practicing, using a piece of charcoal on a flat stone. She showed it to him. She had written a single word. Hope. She pointed from the word to the baby, sleeping peacefully in his cradle. His name, she said, her voice soft but clear. It's not Samuel anymore. It's Hope. Taza looked at the word, then at the child. He repeated it slowly, testing the shape of it in his mouth. His accent curled around the strange vowel, making it something new, something that was both hers and his. Hope, he said again, and a small, rare smile touched the corners of his mouth. He took a piece of charcoal, and next to her, careful letters, he drew his own, a symbol from his people. It meant first light after darkness. Then he painstakingly copied her letters. His lines were shaky, the O a perfect circle, but it was there. Hope. Abigail smiled, tears of a different kind, tears of joy brimming in her eyes. In the days that followed, a new routine settled over them. He taught her things she never could have imagined learning. How to fletch an arrow so it flew true. How to strip bark for a medicinal tea that soothed a cough. How to read the tracks of animals in the mud. How to use flint and steel to conjure a flame, even when the wood was damp. She, in turn, showed him her own magic. How to shape letters into words and words into stories. How to fold a simple piece of cloth into a snug, warm cradle. She taught him how to laugh, a real, deep laugh that came from the belly. Something she suspected he hadn't done in a very long time. They didn't need many words. They had survival. They had fire. They had each other. They had hope. But peace in this new and violent world was never a permanent visitor. It was merely a brief, quiet moment before the next storm. And the next storm was already gathering, its thunderheads building on a far horizon. A storm of men with badges and guns, led by a sheriff who had a secret to bury and a baby to silence. The sound of hooves was what shattered the quiet. Not one horse, but several, moving fast. Abigail straightened from the patch of wild rye she had been gathering, a bundle of stalks clutched in her arms. Sweat beaded on her brow. Across the small meadow, Taza paused, his hand still on the obsidian blade he used for harvesting. He didn't look frightened. He looked ready. He looked toward the ridge, his body a study in tense stillness. Dust. Riders. Abigail's heart seized in her chest, a cold, painful clench. She clutched the baby closer. Hope was slung against her hip in a cloth wrap, dozing in the warmth of the afternoon sun. Taza's posture changed. He didn't reach for his bow, which lay propped against a tree nearby. Instead, he reached for the child. Abigail handed Hope to him without a word, without a moment of hesitation. He took the baby, holding him securely, and stood between her and the approaching riders, a solid, unmoving shadow against the sun. They came fast, 6 of them, their horses frothing at the mouth, their eyes sharp and predatory. At the front rode a man whose face made Abigail's blood run cold. It was Deputy Thomas Crowley. His uniform was caked with dust and his badge was dull with grime, but the cruel sneer on his face was as sharp as ever. Behind him were other men from town, men she recognized, men who had stood by and watched her shop burn, men who had thrown stones. "Well, I'll be damned," Crowley said, pulling his horse to a rough halt that tore up the grass. He spat a wad of tobacco juice near Taza's feet. "Look what the savages dragged in." One of the men behind him laughed, a nasty, brutish sound. Another cocked his rifle, the click echoing in the sudden silence of the meadow. "Miss Moore," Crowley called out, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "We've come to rescue you. Did that wild dog take you against your will? Or were you always planning to shack up with a redskin?" Taza said nothing. His face was granite. He kept Hope close, one powerful arm a shield across the small, sleeping bundle. Abigail stepped out from behind him. Her legs were shaking, but she locked her knees. She would not show them fear. "I am not going anywhere," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Lady," one of the other riders said, dismounting and starting toward her. He had a length of rope coiled in his hand. "He's got you brainwashed. You don't know what you're saying. You ain't safe here." Another man reached for her arm. "Come on now, Abby. Let's not make a scene. We're here to take you home." His grip was firm, bruising, tugging her forward. She jerked her arm free, stumbling back. "Let go of me!" she shouted, her voice ringing with a fury she didn't know she possessed. Taza stiffened, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but he still did not draw a weapon. He knew, and she knew, that one move would be all the excuse they needed to start shooting. Crowley slid from his saddle, moving in closer, his hand hovering near the pistol on his belt. He ignored Taza, focusing all his cruel attention on her. "What did he do to you, huh? Fill your head with savage nonsense? Did he hurt that baby? You tell us the truth, Abigail. We'll believe you." "No, you won't," she snapped back, the words like sparks. "You never did." Crowley's face darkened. "Excuse me. I told the truth before," she cried, stepping forward now, her fear burning away, replaced by white-hot rage. She raised her voice so it echoed across the valley, a declaration of war. "I told the truth, and no one listened. No one believed me when I screamed in the dark. Not my father, not the church, not the so-called righteous men of this town." The wind seemed to hold its breath. The silence was stretched as tight as a drum skin. Taza stood behind her, still unmoving, a silent anchor in her storm. Hope stirred in his arms, letting out a tiny, sleepy cry. "You think he's a savage?" Abigail's voice trembled now, not with fear, but with the force of her conviction. "This man is the only one who stayed up all night when my son had a fever. He rode alone through a storm to find medicine to save him. He built us a home with his own 2 hands and has never once asked for anything in return. He has never made me feel small, or dirty, or afraid." No one spoke. Crowley's jaw was ticking, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Finally, the oldest of the riders, a farmer named Jedediah, leaned toward the deputy. "This ain't right, Tom. She ain't chained up. She ain't screaming for help. Let's just go." Crowley spat on the ground again, his eyes burning with frustrated hatred. "You're making a mistake, girl. A fatal one." Abigail did not flinch. "Maybe," she said, her voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous calm. "But it's my mistake to make." One by one, the riders began to turn their horses, their confidence broken, their mob mentality shattered by the sheer force of her will. Crowley lingered a moment longer, his hand still on his gun. "Don't you come crawling back to town when he decides to scalp you. You ain't got a place there anymore." "We'll make our own place," Abigail said quietly. And with that, they rode off, their hooves thundering back the way they came, leaving a cloud of dust and failure behind them. The moment they were gone, Taza finally exhaled, a long, slow breath, his shoulders slumping just slightly. He handed Hope back to her, his touch gentle. Abigail pressed her cheek to her son's warm head, feeling the wild tremble in her own hands now that the danger had passed. Taza's palm rested lightly on her back, a simple, grounding touch. They stood there in the quiet that followed, a strange, impossible family the world refused to accept. And yet, here they were, still standing. But as Abigail watched the dust settle on the ridge, a cold dread settled in her heart. This wasn't over. Crowley wasn't the real threat. He was just a dog on a leash, and she knew exactly who was holding that leash. Sheriff Wilkins. He knew she was alive, and now he knew where to find her. This wasn't a rescue attempt. It was a reconnaissance mission. The real attack was yet to come. The valley Taza had brought them to was a secret, cradled between 2 gently sloping hills, like a promise cupped in the hands of the earth. No roads reached it, only a winding deer path and the constant whisper of wind through tall grass. Here the sun rose over a blanket of valley mist, and each morning brought the rustle of wild birds and the quiet echo of a life that did not need permission to exist. From the overhang of their small, sturdy home, Abigail watched Hope nurse, her arms wrapped around her child. The house was nothing more than logs, clay, and thatch, but it was a fortress. Behind it, a small garden flourished. Bean vines curled up wooden stakes, and broad squash leaves spread wide like protective palms. A line of fish dried on a rack in the breeze, and a rich rabbit stew simmered over the coals. This was their world, a world they had built from nothing. Taza moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who was part of the land itself. He had dug irrigation ditches from the stream, built a small smokehouse for their meat, and laid traps in the woods that always seemed to yield a meal. He carried Hope without hesitation, And every morning, he would place the child's cradle where the first rays of sun could warm his face. One day he brought a smooth, flat stone from the river and, using the tip of his knife, etched something into it. When Abigail looked, she saw he had carved words in his shaky, newly learned English. He had written, "Hope of fire and moonlight." When she asked him why those words, his answer was simple, and it made her heart ache with a love she couldn't name. Fire is how he survived the fever. Moonlight is how I found you. They spoke more now. His English was still rough and broken, and her knowledge of Comanche was limited to a handful of words for water, food, and danger. But they had created their own language, a language of shared glances, of knowing smiles, of hands that worked together to build, to mend, to sustain. He taught her to dry herbs, to tan hides, to make arrowheads from flint. She showed him how to twist string from cattails and mend seams with stitches so fine they were invisible. Hope grew stronger each week, his giggles echoing through the valley as he chased butterflies with clumsy, outstretched hands. But peace, Abigail was learning, was never a permanent state. It was a temporary truce. It began with a scent, faint at first, the smell of roasted wood far away. Taza, who had been skinning a rabbit, stood suddenly, his head up, his nostrils flaring. He muttered a word in his own tongue, a word that sounded like a curse. "Fire?" she asked, her stomach tightening. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the southern ridge. "South wind brings it." By nightfall, the smell was a thick, acrid haze that stung the eyes and throat. The sky to the south glowed with a sick orange light. The trees themselves seemed to whisper of the danger, their leaves rustling with a nervous energy. Taza worked with a focused intensity. He packed a satchel with dried meat, a full water skin, and their few precious tools. He wrapped Hope securely against his own chest in a deerskin sling. They evacuated their few chickens, shooing them toward the safety of the river. They covered the garden with soaked hides and dug a shallow trench around their small home. Still the flames came. They watched them flicker on the distant ridge, a line of orange ghosts dancing their way closer and closer. When the fire hit the valley, it did not creep. It exploded. It came with a roar, like a freight train, a wall of flame and heat that devoured everything in its path. Ash, thick and gray, fell like a morbid snow. The air became thick, unbreathable. Through the swirling smoke, Taza saw their small neighbor's shed, a storage hut for drying hides, collapse under a shower of burning branches, and through the roar of the fire, they heard a child scream. "No!" Abigail gasped, her eyes wide with horror. She knew a family of trappers had built a lean-to a half-mile downriver. "There's no time," Taza said, his voice grim, pulling her toward the relative safety of the riverbank. But he was already looking back. Another scream, weaker this time. He looked at her, at Hope, then at the wall of fire. He made a decision. Stay here, in the water. Before she could argue, he was gone, running. Not away from the fire, but directly into the choking, black smoke. He found the child, a boy no older than 5, curled beside a burning stump, coughing, paralyzed with terror. Taza grabbed him and bolted back, but a falling, fiery limb caught his shoulder, sending them both tumbling to the ground. He roared in pain, but he held on to the boy. With blood in his eyes from a gash on his forehead and the child clinging to his neck, he staggered back through the suffocating darkness. Abigail had not stayed still. She was a woman forged in fire, and she would not be defeated by it. She had dragged their water barrels to the front of the house, building a shield of wet blankets across the walls, dousing the thatched roof again and again. When Taza collapsed near the porch, she pulled the terrified boy away, and with a strength she didn't know she had, dragged Taza's heavy, unconscious frame into the cabin, slamming the door against the blistering heat. The next hours passed in a blur of smoke and terror. Abigail soaked cloths, pressing cool water to Taza's burned skin. She kept Hope and the little boy, whose name she learned was Eli, tucked in the small root cellar she had dug, covering them with buckets of damp earth to shield them from the worst of the heat. When the fire finally passed, roaring its way up the next ridge, the valley was a blackened, smoking ruin. But their home, scarred and scorched, still stood, a tiny, defiant island in a sea of devastation. Taza drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. His shoulder was badly burned, his lungs damaged from the smoke. On the third morning, Abigail sat beside him, rewrapping the bandages with trembling fingers. "You almost died," she said, her voice raw with emotion. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on her face. "But I did not," he rasped. "You saved him," she whispered, gesturing to where Eli slept peacefully. He needed saving. She took his good hand, his strong, calloused, worn hand, and held it against her heart. Her face was streaked with ash and tears. "I am not the preacher's daughter anymore," she said, the words pouring out of her, a confession and a vow all in one. "I don't belong to a church or a town or a family name, but if you will have me, I am yours. Not by law, not by a sermon, by soul." He did not speak. He only lifted her hand to his lips and kissed the small scar on her palm, where a splinter from the fire had dug deep. The gesture was quiet, gentle, but more final than any spoken vow. Hope babbled from his blanket, and the boy Eli stirred nearby. Abigail smiled through her wet lashes. They were a strange family, forged not by blood or tradition, but by fire and will. By nightfall, Taza was strong enough to stand, leaning on a branch as a cane. He watched Abigail chase Hope across the singed but already resilient earth, while the orphan Eli clung tightly to her skirts. Later, Taza returned to the flat stone by the river. Beneath the words, "Hope," of fire and moonlight, he carved another name. Eli, found in fire, kept by grace. No last names, only meaning, only belonging. But the fire had not been a random act of nature. It had been a tool. The smoke had been a signal. And now the men who had set it were closing in, drawn to the one small patch of green in a valley of black. They knew their prey was trapped. Spring returned to the valley not with a gentle touch, but with a fierce, determined rush. Soft rains washed the ash from the soil, and the land, scarred but not broken, pulsed with new life. Green shoots pushed their way through the blackened earth. Buds appeared on the cottonwood trees. The call of birds returning to old nests filled the air, and with the season's rebirth, something deeper, stronger, took root among the four souls who had carved a home from exile. On a morning dusted with golden light, Abigail held her son close beneath a sprawling willow tree by the river. "It is time," she said softly to Taza, who stood beside her. "He needs a name, a real name, one that will hold both the sun and the shadow of who we are." Taza's gaze was on the sky, but his attention was entirely on her. "Hope," he said, the word as natural as breathing. Then he added, "Hope Taza." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. He was not just protecting this child, he was claiming him as his own. The name was spoken aloud just once, a quiet vow between two people, and then Taza carved it gently into the old stone near the stream where their new life had begun. Hope Taza. The child did not carry a surname from one bloodline. He carried two worlds in his bones, the silence of the Great Plains and the echo of church bells, now long forgotten. In the weeks that followed, their small homestead transformed. Abigail, seeing the fear and uncertainty in the eyes of Eli and the other children from the few trapper families who had survived the fire, opened a small school. It was just a canvas tent pitched beside her garden, but under its roof she taught children, both white and Comanche, to read, to write, to stitch, to tell stories not just with words but with needle and ink. Taza would join her some mornings. He would sit with the children, etching the symbols of his people onto pieces of bark and bone, telling them the ancient stories of the ancestors, the rivers and the spirits that lived in the wind. No child paid with coin. They paid with curiosity and were repaid with care. Hope sat among them all, laughing and learning, his world made not of hard pews and shame, but of rich earth and acceptance. But while they were building a community, another community was plotting their destruction. The fire had been set by bounty hunters, hired by Sheriff Wilkins to flush them out. The plan had failed, but it had confirmed Abigail's location. Now the sheriff was done with subtlety. He was coming himself, along with Reverend Elias Moore, who had whipped the town into a righteous frenzy. They were coming to reclaim the preacher's daughter, to punish the savage, and to silence the child who was living proof of the sheriff's sin. One evening as the sun slid low, casting long shadows across the valley, Taza, Abigail, and the two children climbed the ridge overlooking their home. Far beyond the trees, you could just make out the distant lights of the town Abigail had once called home, a place that had judged her, condemned her, and cast her into the shadow. She did not flinch from the memory now. She placed a hand on Taza's shoulder. "I do not need to be welcomed by them," she said, her voice steady and strong. "I only need to be loved by you." A sound broke the stillness, a soft thwip, followed by a vibration in the grass beside them. A single arrow had landed just feet away, its shaft quivering. It wasn't a warning shot, it was a message. Taza knelt beside it. The arrow was fletched with the feathers of a hawk and marked with the symbols of his old tribe. It was from his past, and it was not a friendly greeting. They had found him. His own people, the ones who had cast him out, were now allies of the men from the town. They had made a deal. The bounty on Abigail and the child in exchange for the return of the traitor, Taza. He turned to Abigail, lifting the arrow for her to see. His face was grim. "They are coming," he said. "All of them." She looked down at the valley, at their small home, at the school tent, at the life they had painstakingly built. And then she looked at him, at his strong, determined face. "Then let them come," she said. The attack came at dawn. They swarmed over the ridge, a posse of townsfolk led by Sheriff Wilkins and Reverend Moore, their faces twisted with hate, and flanking them, silent and deadly, were a dozen warriors from Taza's former tribe, led by a fearsome brave named Blackstone, the man Taza had defied years ago. But Taza and Abigail were ready. They didn't fight them in the open. They used the land. The valley was their fortress. Taza had spent the night setting snares and deadfalls along the main path. Abigail had dug pits filled with sharpened stakes, covering them with flimsy branches and leaves. The first volley of arrows was met not with screams, but with the satisfying thud of riders and horses tumbling into hidden traps. Confusion ripped through the attackers' ranks. Wilkins roared orders, firing his pistol wildly into the trees. "He's in there! Flush him out!" Abigail, hidden in a thicket with Eli and Hope, fired a single shot from an old rifle Taza had taught her to use. The shot wasn't aimed to kill. It was aimed at a hornet's nest hanging directly above the sheriff's head. The nest dropped, and the posse was swarmed, their righteous charge turning into a chaotic, flailing dance of pain. From the other side of the valley, Taza let out a war cry. It was not the cry of a lone warrior, but the call of a wolf to its pack. And the pack answered. From the trees emerged the trapper families, the parents of the children Abigail had taught. They were armed with hunting rifles and a fierce loyalty to the man who had saved their children from the fire. The battle turned. The townsfolk, expecting an easy fight, found themselves caught in a crossfire, outsmarted and outmaneuvered. In the chaos, Abigail saw her father, his face pale with shock and fury, trying to rally the retreating men. And then she saw her mother. Ruth had come with them. But she wasn't cowering. She was holding a ledger book, the sheriff's own records. During the confusion, she had slipped into his office and stolen it. "Elias!" Ruth screamed, her voice ringing with a strength no one knew she possessed. "Tell them the truth. Tell them about the money the sheriff paid you, the money to keep quiet about what he did to our daughter." The world seemed to stop. The fighting paused. Reverend Moore froze, his face a mask of horror. Sheriff Wilkins turned, his eyes wide with panic, and leveled his pistol at Ruth. But before he could fire, an arrow, fletched with the feather of a hawk, flew from the trees and buried itself in his gun hand. Taza stepped out of the shadows, his bow still raised. It was over. The conspiracy was exposed. The lies were laid bare for all to see. The townsfolk looked from the bleeding sheriff to the disgraced reverend, and the fight went out of them. Blackstone and his warriors, seeing the cowardice of their allies, simply faded back into the forest, their deal broken. Abigail walked out into the clearing, her head held high. She walked past the defeated men, her eyes meeting her father's for one last time. There was no hatred in her gaze, only a vast, empty pity. She walked to her mother and took her hand. They had not just survived. They had won. They had defended their home, exposed the darkness, and brought the truth into the light. The valley was theirs, consecrated by courage and fire. They were a strange patchwork family, a community of outcasts and survivors, and they were finally truly free. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the sting of injustice and the quiet, fierce power of a love that defies all boundaries, then saddle up. Because this is just the beginning of the trail. Here at Cinematic Western Sagas, we don't just tell tales. We unearth the forgotten truths of the frontier, stories of courage, devotion, and the relentless fight for a place to call home. Every story is a journey into a heart that refuses to be broken. Subscribe now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single ride into the heart of the Wild West. And remember to comment below. What do you think was the bravest thing Abigail did? Some love isn't written in law or scripture. It's carved in courage, stitched in silence, and whispered on the wind. This is Cinematic Western Sagas, where the West was wild but the heart was wilder.